The Blues, an introduction and 5 levels of improvisation. The blues is a musical form and genre that began in African American communities in the southern United States in the mid-19th century that has been deeply influential to music ever since. The legacy, structure, and form of the blues laid the foundation of thousands of compositions across many genres. Once you start to recognize the blues, you begin to hear it everywhere. Many of the genres that subsequently evolved from the blues have been described as 3 chords and the truth, which is not only an incredibly beautiful idea, but it also means that the blues is very approachable for anyone learning to improvise. And that can't be said for every genre of music. You might think of learning the blues like learning how to play chess. The basic rules of the game are pretty easy to learn, and you can get started playing right away. But then you learn a tiny bit of basic strategy and level up your play. But chess is a big world, and there's always something new to learn if you want to dig deeper. And the blues is pretty similar. But unlike chess, where players are actively trying to beat each other and make sure that there's a clear winner and loser, music isn't like that. Musicians play with each other, not against each other. And while an advanced musician might sound impressive and even intimidating, they're often very encouraging to other musicians. And some of the most rewarding musical experiences you can have will come from playing with someone who plays at a much higher level than you. And speaking of levels, I've previously talked about the 5 levels of jazz improvisation, which is a framework that applies perfectly to the blues. And this video is going to be a bit more practical since we're focusing on a really specific type of music to improvise over. But it's actually 6 levels, because we really have to start at level 0, which is the blues form and chord progression. The blues is generally based on dominant chords built on the 1, 4, and 5 chords of a given key. In the key of C, that's C7, F7, and G7. And those chords appear in the blues in this specific order. But it's worth noting that trying to define and explain the blues is a bit like trying to define pizza. There are so many styles and versions, and while it's fun to get into arguments about our favorites and gatekeep what even counts as pizza, and please do so in the comments, the only reason we can have those conversations is because they share enough common attributes that even though they're very different, enough people will still agree that they're kinda like pizza. Similarly, there are quite a few different variations of the blues. And while each of them is fascinating and beautiful in their own right, this version is the one I'll be focusing on today. It's sometimes called the quick change blues because it goes to the 4 chord in the 2nd bar. But it's by far the version of the blues that I see, hear, and play most often in my experience as a jazz musician. If you walk into a jazz jam and ask to play a blues without any other qualification, this is probably the one everyone will default to. But even this most basic and common version of the blues is kind of magical in that it works at virtually every tempo. It sounds great when it's really slow, or when it's really fast. And it definitely works at every tempo in between. And the blues can also be played in any key. Different keys are certainly more common in certain genres, but any of them are technically possible. And this figure, by the way, is called the circle of fifths. It's a pretty useful tool for music theory, but all you really need to know right now is that if you pick any note on the circle as your home key, that is, as the 1 chord, the note 1 position counterclockwise tells you the root of the 4 chord, and the note 1 position clockwise tells you the root of the 5 chord. And if you build dominant chords on these notes, you get the primary chords of the blues. And that works anywhere on the circle in any key. And while those rules are pretty simple, they can be pretty easy to mix up too. But there is this very cool product from NoisyClan, sponsor of this video, called the Decoder, that may make navigating all these keys quite a bit easier, at a glance. It's basically a circle of fifths that's been constructed in a really genius way. If you look at the top, the home key is in this window, and the 4 and the 5 chords are here and labeled as such. So you can just spin it to any key you want, like A flat major, and see that the primary chords of the blues are A flat for 1, D flat for 4, and E flat for 5. And for a blues in B, then you're looking at B, E, and F sharp. And if you're interested in other aspects of theory or songwriting, you'll also find these other windows useful that show the relative minor of the home key, as well as the 2, 3, and 7 chords. And of course, the key signature for the home key is here, which affects how all of these chords are played. The decoder also comes with this book that has all kinds of information about how to interpret the information on the decoder, build chords, transpose, and build chord progressions. And I also love how the decoder even has this little kickstand on the back built in, so you can just prop it up on the desk or table and have it in front of you. If you'd like to pick one up, NoisyClan is offering 15% off all orders using the code BRAD15 at checkout. And that code can also be used on any of their other products, and they've got a bunch of really cool ones, including some very beautiful and high-quality music stands and one of the most ingenious designs for portable stands that I've ever seen. Again, use my code BRAD15 to save 15% at checkout. Thank you to NoisyClan. And with that, it's time to jump into level 1 of blues improvisation, which is listening. Music is like a language in a lot of ways, and the blues is basically a dialect. It has its own musical vocabulary, pacing, style, and cadence. And while theory, grammar, and reading are all powerful learning tools, language is primarily learned through listening. When you listen to the blues, you'll hear that 12-bar form and chord progression played over and over again. You'll learn what those 12 bars feel like, both harmonically and rhythmically, as they repeat back to the top and start a new chorus. Through each chorus, you could hear any number of different melodies, lyrics, riffs, backgrounds, and of course, improvised solos played on top. Try to notice what kind of rhythms, note density, and pacing seem to work well over the blues. Also notice articulation, vibrato, bends, and other special effects. And notice how some note choices seem to have a lot of tension against the chord being played, while others have very little. Because when you're improvising yourself, you need to listen to your own note choices too, and decide if you need to adjust. Does the note you're playing fit with the chord being played? Does it have a bit of tension, or is it really dissonant? We'll get into the details of note choices at later levels, but for now, just listen and remember that there are no wrong notes. Only notes with more or less tension or dissonance. And dissonant doesn't mean sounds bad. Sometimes it sounds great, but usually we do want to resolve tension in music at some point. So 2 things to keep in mind while learning to improvise are: there is no tension or dissonance that can't be resolved or at least lessened by moving a semitone higher or lower. And there are no wrong notes, only incomplete resolutions. So, listen. Listen to great recordings, to live music, and to yourself as you're playing. It's the foundation of all things musical. Level 2 is where it starts to get practical. Level 2 is about using a scale or key to improvise, and the blues scale is a great place to start. The minor blues scale is built using this interval pattern: 1, flat 3, 4, sharp 4, 5, flat 7, and then it loops back to 1. And of course, like all scales, the blues scale extends into every octave and transposes to every key. Feel free to pause this and screenshot if you like, or head over to my Patreon where members will get this and many more blues resources. Check the description for links. Now, this scale has a pretty bluesy sound all on its own, and it works over all the chords of the blues pretty well. So start messing around with the blues scale, and if you've got a decent sense of time and style, because level 1, you can play basically whatever you want, and it's probably going to sound pretty good. But for those musicians that are still a bit mystified or overwhelmed, here's a routine I like to work through with my beginner students. First, of course, we learn the notes of the blues scale, and I usually do it in B-flat concert because that's a pretty jazz-friendly key, but feel free to do this exercise in any key that makes sense for you. Then, you try improvising, but only using just the first 2 notes of the blues scale. And you play a chorus or 2, or possibly trading with your teacher, using just those 2 notes. Play simple ideas in time, probably mostly quarters and eighth notes, and it'll probably sound okay. It's simple, but it works. Then, as you get more comfortable, start adding more notes of the blues scale, 1 at a time. If you play another note by accident or get lost, that's just fine. Just take a breath and try to find your way again. When you add the sharp 4 and the 5, it starts to sound pretty bluesy. And then finally you add in the last 2 notes and you're playing the whole blues scale to improvise. Then practice and have fun. There's a lot of different things to try, but you can really make a lot of music and have a lot of fun and even sound like you know what you're doing with nothing more than just the blues scale. Level 3 is chord theory, also known as playing the changes, which is paying attention to what chord is happening at any given moment and adjusting the scales and arpeggios you play to fit them as the chord changes from bar to bar. A great exercise to learn the notes of the chord changes and remember which one comes when is to build up the arpeggios note by note, chorus by chorus. Start with the roots and play a whole chorus of whole notes on just the roots. Play it a few times until it's memorized. Then add the next note of the chord and play a chorus or 2 of just half notes on the root and third of each chord. After that, continue the pattern and outline the triad, 1, 3, and 5 of each chord. Then, finally play the whole arpeggio to the 7th. You might have to run this exercise a few times, and you can probably come up with a few variations on your own, but it can be really helpful to memorize the changes and learn to execute them on your instrument, which will be helpful because the notes of these arpeggios sound really good in a solo. Here's a chorus of the blues using only chord tones to improvise. In addition to the arpeggios of these chords, they also have an associated scale which you can use to improvise. And for dominant chords, that's usually the Mixolydian scale. And all you really need to know about that scale is that Mixolydian is just like the major scale, except the 7th note is lowered by a semitone. But now with this scale, you've got a bunch of notes to choose from for any given chord change, and these notes fall into 3 categories. First, the chord tones. They fall on the root, 3rd, 5th, and 7th degrees of the scale, which is just the arpeggio that we've already talked about. They sound really consonant over the chord, because they are the chord. Next are the tensions, the 2nd and 6th degrees of the scale, which do sound good, but unsurprisingly, they have tension against the chord. So feel free to play them as much as you like, but you might consider resolving them to a chord tone. Finally, there's the avoid note, the 4th degree of the scale, which might seem a bit scary, but it really just means that you should probably use this note as a passing tone between other scale degrees, rather than a note to pause on for very long. And these patterns hold true in all keys. Chord tones are 1, 3, 5, and 7, and they're the most consonant. 2 and 6 are tensions, and be careful of pausing too long on that avoid tone on the 4th. Here's a demonstration using a mix of arpeggios, chord tones, tensions, and a bit of the blues scale too. Level 4 is Substitutions. One of the most interesting things about dominant chords is that they have a huge number of available scale options, all of which have their own unique flavor that you can substitute pretty freely. First off, there's the major pentatonic scale, and the major blues scale, which is actually the same scale with an additional flat 3. Both sound great over the blues and are really useful because they have no avoid tones. Then there's also Bebop scales, which is kind of like a major and a Mixolydian scale put together because it has a lowered and natural 7th in the same scale. And then you get into way more colorful scales, like Lydian dominant, whole tone, the half-whole diminished scale, or the altered scale. These scales really start to blur the idea of what is a tension and what is an avoid tone. So experiment and use your ear and figure out what sounds you like. There's also something known as sidestepping, or playing outside the key, and we've already seen some pretty spicy note choices in some of these substitute scales. But sidestepping generally refers to playing in a key that just happens to be different from the one that the rest of the band is playing. It sounds crazy, but your ear will hear some sort of internal structure and logic to what you're playing, but also hear it as a tension against the chord that hopefully you'll resolve. Kind of like taking the listener on a journey in and out of a key and back again. Here's what that might sound like. Level 5 is tension and release. If you've gotten here, you've been on a journey of learning how to improvise on the blues. You've learned to listen and use your ears, how to improvise using a blues scale. how to navigate through the scales and arpeggios of the blues, and how to use various scale substitutions to add more harmonic color to your solos. Level 5 is the consequence of learning all these things, applying them together and interchangeably in order to manage tension and release. And as the levels have progressed, so has complexity. But intuition follows a slightly different path, and level 5 is highly intuitive. At lower levels, improvisers can usually tell you with great specificity what they're playing at any given moment. But as you get into these upper levels with highly trained and experienced soloists, they may struggle to explain how any specific note or phrase was played. They're just managing tension and release and wielding a wide variety of improvisational tools to execute that. As in the previous video on improvisation, I'm not going to demonstrate level 5, not so much because I think I can't, but mostly because level 5 is magical and organic. It happens live in a club, or on a street corner, or an album, when a great musician is in the zone and making a statement. So listen to the greats and get out and hear some live music, and you'll hear plenty of examples of what level 5 sounds like. But if you do want to have a deeper conversation about these or any other musical topics, or just need a bit of coaching and guidance while working through the levels and learning to improvise, please feel free to get in touch to set up some online lessons. Through this channel, I've been able to meet and work with musicians from all over the world about all kinds of musical topics, and it's been a really incredible experience. More information about lessons and pricing are available on my website. Special thanks to NoisyClan for sponsoring this video. Be sure to use my code BRAD15 at checkout to save 15% off the Circle of Fifths decoder and all of their other cool products. And thank you to my channel members and patrons who help make all of these videos possible and have access to resources like blues exercises and all of the solo transcriptions from this video, all transposed for every key for every instrument. They also get access to a huge scale syllabus and method to learn all your scales in no time, as based on my video, Learn All Your Scales in 24 Hours. As always, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.